Yeah, I don't think so. That's stairs. Oh. Great. Here, I think that's. And not. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Our invisible friend. Yeah, but you must get things. It's a gigantic reason. I don't even know. I was like, my kid was it, I like turned too fast. Now like my girl. Yeah, I was. I'm just you're so funny. Yes, you're so funny. Mom, no. Oh, I remember that. See how you remember. You do say what I first what? I was just really screwing myself. Yeah, it's fun time where he dropped a bunch of cards, so we both have like pick them up and so and I'm like kind of above it's like knocked out. Yeah, and then like literally on our first date we were sitting in this bed watching and I like leaned back and she went they're very quick. Yeah, they're really good. Like I like and that's my mom. Yeah, they're looking at gym near us. And they all played basketball. I never know it's young, but like middle school, like whatever. And not me in my head, like I didn't know what I did. I'm like surprised. It's like, ow. I didn't love on my head after. I think he was also sweaty. So I was like, oh yeah. I said, I was like, oh, that hurt. And it's like also he really did that to me. No, made it feel bad. Yeah. Yeah. But I was like, oh god. Makes me think of when I was younger and he was on the bottom side of my teeth. Like, oh, I have on top of it. Oh yeah, yeah. I hate it. Oh, anyway, it's mine forever. Yeah. I mean that's okay. So I middle of the game and somebody keeps calling right up in my face very short distance and it's like oh no and it's like not actually but it looks like oh I wouldn't yeah my do that it's like it's just aesthetic. He's like, yeah. I don't care. I'm like, ugly. They don't want they don't. They change. It's like the same thing. Everybody else. First thing. I don't know, whatever. One or two. I think it was. Yeah. That one time. Yeah, it's supposed to go I'm like, oh, you wonder what I think.
And very much.
Hello, folks. No, good. Hi, everyone. We can get our seats so we can get rolling. That was great. There we go. Hi, my name is Michael Esbon, Assistant Director of Graduate Architecture. So great to see you for yet another great lecture event. Before we start, I have a couple of things to announce. First, thank you as always to Potomac Valley chapter of the AAA for helping us achieve CEF credits for this lecture from a special guest. We're always appreciative of the work they do with us, collaboration with us. For the students in the room, please do sign in using this QR code. You do not need to upload a picture, just your name and your course number. Thank you very much for doing that. The system is working really well, actually, I should say, behind the scenes. So thank you for participating in this. And now I just want to announce what we're doing here. We have an incredibly special guest. Tom Fisher is joining us, and he's going to be introduced in just a moment. But this is a special lecture. It is the Cold Influence Thomas Eichbaum lecture, and it's hosted by Smith Group. And in a minute, I'm going to introduce Bob Bull from Smith Group, who is going to come up to tell us a little bit more about this special endowment that's supporting not only this lecture, but our reception, which is happening immediately after the lecture. We'll all go over to the great space. There's going to be food and fun, so we're looking forward to seeing you there. And I just want to say I need to shout out and give some thank yous for folks who've worked really hard to put the reception together. Leah Droll, Nicole Bradshaw, Paula Riff. I'm sure I'm forgetting others, but thank you to those three especially for the work that they've done and helping to make a great event. And so again, we'll go right after the lecture over to that event and it'll be fun. But for now, I'd like to introduce Bob Bull from Smith Group, and he can tell us a little bit more about the Cold Influence Thomas Eichbaum lecture.
Thank you, Micah. Yeah, again, my name is Bob Bull. I'm East Region Director for Smith Group, based here in Washington, D.C. I had the distinct privilege of working with both Tom and Holden, or also known as Coke Florence, two very influential architects here in the Washington, D.C. area. They had several decades of influence on the region, and I worked closely with them, and anybody else, my colleagues that are here with me, know that they were very visionary and unique in their mentorship, and we'd like to honor them with this lecture series here and continue the architectural dialogue that they helped to inspire in us as our mentors. Colden, or Coke Florence, was known as the Dean of Washington Architects. He was often referred to himself as an editor-in-chief, but one of the things that was very unique about Coke and the firm that he ran was that it was an incubation firm within the Washington, D.C. area, where many young architects would come to work for him, learn the trade and learn how to conduct themselves within the profession of architecture, and then they would go on and start their own firm. And so Coke was very fond of that, or very proud of that, and that's why he referred to himself as the editor-in-chief of many of the architectural firms that were well known around the Washington, D.C. area. And anybody that knows anything about Coke, he had a very unique personality, a real gift of wit. And in fact, he would often have one-liners that would be notorious throughout the community, that we have taken the habit of notating them in a list that we often refer to in our own studio engagements, even to this day. And he played a very pivotal role into shaping the built environment and landscape of Washington, D.C. Throughout the 20th century. Over his career that spanned 60 years, Coke's impact on the metropolitan area and the built environment was profound. His notable projects included the Capital One Arena, where the Washington Wizards and the Washington Capitals play. He also did the Visitor Center at the Washington National Cathedral, both award-winning projects. He also was very influential at adaptive reuse, and several of the projects that he had a very big impact on were the creation of the National Building Museum, which was the transformation of the old Patent and Trade Office in Washington, D.C., and also the creation of the Museum for Women in the Arts, both very significant adaptive reuse projects. In 2000, Coke was awarded the Washington, D.C. Centennial Medal Award, which is a unique award that's given to someone of very high esteem and prestige within the Washington, D.C. architectural community. And he, throughout his career, he won over 40 design awards, including an AIA National Award for the Tiber Island Urban Redevelopment Project, And also in 1999, he won an award for the National Postal Museum, which was also an adaptive reuse project, winning a National Design Award from the AIA. Koch began his career working with Clothilde Woodward Smith, who was a very influential female architect in the Washington, D.C. area. She was one of the very first AIA fellows, female fellows. And if you don't know anything about her, she's definitely someone to go research and learn a little bit more about her impact on the Washington, D.C. community. Koch joined Kai's Lethbridge and Condon in 1961 and became a named partner in 1975. He became known, and the firm then became known as Kai's Condon and Florence. He remained one of the strongest design influences in the city. And then Tom Eichbaum joined him shortly after graduating from the University of Maryland and became a named partner with the firm in 1984, then becoming Florence Eschbaum, Eschbaum and King. And then the firm merged with Smith Group, the predecessor firm, or the firm that we currently work for, in 1997. And throughout the continuation of Koch's career and Tom's career, they worked with the Smith Group in the Washington, D.C. office for additional design awards and many influential projects for many years. Tom was, as I said, a graduate at the University of Maryland. He was one of the first graduates of the program, I believe in 1972. He went on to get his master's degree after leaving the University of Maryland. And then Tom, one of the things that people may not know about Tom is a very unique upbringing. His father worked very closely with Louis Kahn, and throughout his upbringing, helped build models for some of Louis Kahn's very initial projects through the collaboration with his father. Tom actually continued this tradition throughout his professional career, built many of the finished models that we used in the Washington, D.C. Office of Smith Group, and even into retirement, continued to provide professional quality models for many of the projects that he worked on. One of the other unique things about Tom was he was one of the first UMD graduates to design a building on campus, and that includes the School of Business, which is right down the street from here. Tom was a very impactful mentor and leader in our firm. In fact, he was very innovative and forward-thinking in terms of environmental sustainability, and was instrumental in the delivery and award of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation Merrill Center, which was a project the Smith Group completed in the early 90s and was the very first LEED Platinum project in the world. So with that legacy, I'm proud to be here to represent both Tom and Koch and continue the architectural legacy that they left for us and enable this continued dialogue with the lecture tonight. So with that, I'll hand it off to Mohammed.
Yes, special thanks to our colleagues at Mass Group for supporting this event and the reception. It's my pleasure. Sorry, Smith Group. I apologize. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Tom Fisher is a professor in the School of Architecture, director of the Minnesota Design Center, and former dean of the College of Design at the University of Minnesota. Prior to those roles, he served as the editorial director of Progressive Architecture magazine. The recipient of the 2025 Topaz Medallion for Excellence in Architectural Education, which, as you may know, is the biggest honor in the field of architectural education. He has served on the AIA, NAP, and ACSA boards, and is the incoming chancellor of the ACSA's College of Distinguished Professors. He has written and co-authored 12 books, over 80 book chapters and introductions, and over 640 articles in major publications. His most recent book, Space, Structures, and Design in a Post-Pandemic World, was published by Routledge in 2022. His scholarship has focused on ethical issues involving the built environment, including public health, equity, and sustainability. And his funded research has looked at how those issues pertain to the future of underserved communities in the US, as well as to the needs of underserved nations across the world. Most recently, He has led a global climate geodesign challenge that has developed carbon assessment tools to measure the impacts on the climate, on the global climate of our land use and infrastructure decisions. I have had the pleasure of working with Tom at the Epidemic Urbanism Initiative in the last 4 years and have found him to be one of the most visionary architectural educators in the world. So we are really, it's an honor and it's a privilege to have you here. So, and please join me in giving him a warm round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you. And I think Mohammed has to get to an airplane. He's going to Cordoba, Spain tonight. So good, safe travels, Mohammed. Great to be here from one Big Ten school to another. And, you know, this is actually the first time I've been on this campus, which was really odd because I actually went to college not too far from here. I got an architectural degree from Cornell, but I also read the great books at St. John's College over in Annapolis. And so love Maryland, and it's good to be back. Mohammed asked me to talk a bit about some of the work that we've been doing in its relationship to public health. So I wanted to talk about sort of 3 categories of impacts that public health and particularly pandemics have had on architecture. I'm going to talk about buildings. I'm going to talk about cities. And I'm also going to talk about higher education. Because one of the things about pandemics is that they're one of the only phenomena that affects every human being on the planet at the same time. Right? So there are these global events that have enormous impact. They tend to last a couple of years, and the tail goes on for decades, right? So we are now in that tail of COVID-19, and we might want to forget the fact that we went through a pandemic, but it will affect us in the way we think about the built environment and the way we think about higher education for years to come. And so that's really what I wanted to talk about tonight. My interest in this goes back. I mean, I was writing articles about this back in 2010. These were 2 articles I did in Places Journal. One looking at viral cities, how a disease gets transferred in cities and how cities have often been designed to address this issue. And I'll talk about the specific effects that that has. Also been long interested in Frederick Olmsted, who we all study from, you know, the landscape architecture point of view. We often forget that he was a key figure in the emergence of the public health movement in the United States. Around the Civil War, he joined a group of doctors in Boston, and they went to Abraham Lincoln to make the point that there were more Union soldiers dying of disease than were dying of bullets. And they mapped out who died at Gettysburg and of what, and actually made a convincing argument to Abraham Lincoln, who commissioned them to start what was then called the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which we now call the American Red Cross. And so here's a landscape architect who was the head of what is now the American Red Cross. And what's been interesting is that these 2 fields, design and public health, kind of split after the Civil War, and public health went in a very epidemiology direction, but is actually now coming back and being increasingly interested in our world, because a lot of the public health challenges of our time are chronic and they're related to the built environment, issues like obesity, issues like pandemics, and what have you. And so this is, I think, an opportunity for those of us in the design and planning fields to think about a new kind of partnership with our public health colleagues, where Frederick Olmsted was 150 plus years ago. So also, as Mohammed said, I'd been writing about pandemics. My colleagues thought I was crazy why I was interested in pandemics until we actually went through one and decided to take a lot of the material that I had been researching and put it together in a book. And this is the book that Mohammed mentioned that came out in 2022. And as you can see from the table of contents, I not only look at infrastructure and built environment issues like cities, streets, communities, landscapes, but also I talk about how pandemics change essentially how we are in the world, the impact that it's had, and we are all experiencing this, how we learn, how we shop, how we work. Do we do things remotely? Do we do them in person? You know, these are issues that we're all now addressing in our daily lives that really are the impact of the pandemic. And also, as you can see from the first section, in addition to space and design, enormous impacts on politics, economics, and environment. After every pandemic, there is inflation. Inevitably, there is inflation. After every pandemic, there is an economic boom. And it's simply demographics. A lot of people die, and the people who are left, there are fewer people to do the same or more work, and so incomes go up. In many respects, the Renaissance was a result of the Black Death, right? A lot of people died. The people who left had a lot more money and a lot more free time, actually, and a lot more agency. And so a lot of the things that we've been going through in the last few years, inflation, an economic boom that we're in, and also political division. That's another factor that comes in repeatedly when you look at the impacts of pandemic. So a lot of what we're going through now could have been predicted, because this is what happens to societies after they go through one of these events. But just a few sort of points that come up repeatedly in this history. Pandemics are accelerants. They take human societies and they take things that existed before and they accelerate them. And we all saw this, right? So we had Zoom prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's just we didn't use it very much, right? People did telecommute. People did shop online. It just wasn't the dominant way in which we operated. But for this pandemic, one of the things that I think is profoundly important for our fields, that this was the first time in human history where if we had a digital device and an internet connection, you could get almost anything you needed delivered to your door or your device. I mean, just think about that. We're a species that has always had to go out into the world to get things, right? To shop, to learn, to work. And for the first time, technology allowed us to not have to do that. Now, many people did have to do that. We had essential workers. So it also reveals inequities. You realize that there are people in a society who are disadvantaged, and not only in terms of essential workers being exposed to COVID-19, but also the fact that if you did not have that digital connection, you were held back, right? So the idea of digital equity is a really important outcome of this most recent pandemic. It refocuses on public health. That's why we're here. And this is what I'm talking about. I mean, we forget the importance of public health and how much of the built environment has been designed with public health in mind. We just don't sort of think about it as much as maybe we should. And then finally, the reason to talk about this is that pandemics create enormous opportunities for those who understand the implications of them. And so just as they said, the Renaissance after the Black Death, I mean, every pandemic creates space, because what happens is that the old world no longer works. And so it's an opportunity to rethink almost everything, right? And so we're in that period right now. And so for all of you who are students and thinking about your future, there are so many design needs and opportunities as a result of the pandemic than any generation has had in quite a while. So just a little bit, I thought just a little bit of history on this. The Black Death, the one that's probably best known in Europe, killed almost 50% of the European population. I mean, can you imagine that? And this was a bubonic plague. This was a plague that was brought by fleas that were on rats coming in from ships. And it lasted, it went in various cycles from the 1300s as far back as up to 1665, where it swept through London. These were there's interesting maps showing how it kind of swept through. The famous book, The Journal of the Plague Year, sort of talks about that. But, and so you see that these plagues have these enormous impacts. The other thing, it's a great leveler. It doesn't care whether you're rich or poor. In fact, actually, plagues tend to kill the rich far faster than they do the poor, because, you know, the more you're interacting with people, depending on the virus, right? So a lot of the merchants who were bringing in ships in the Black Death were the wealthy merchants, and they were the ones who were dying first of the Black Death, because they had more exposure than poor communities that were a little bit more remote, right? And so it really is this leveler to human societies. But so in each one of these, I want to talk about the architectural impacts, the urban impacts, and the higher ed impacts. So the Black Death really started a number of new kinds of building types. For example, the hospital as a type changed as a result of the Black Death. This is a plague island in Venice. So what would happen if you brought your ship in from Venice in the 1300s? You had to stay on this island for 14 days to see if you died. And if you didn't die and you weren't contagious, then they would let you into the city. You also had to take all of the goods out of your ship, spread it on this courtyard, and let ultraviolet light disinfect all of the goods before they would allow you to bring them into Venice. right? So they were actually seeing hospitals as sort of quarantine spaces, right? And also the very idea of medicine changed, where it went from this idea of us putting people in hospital and just to see if they died to actually trying to cure them. It had enormous impact on cities. This is the Noli map, which many of you are probably aware of Rome. And we talk a lot about the spaces that it shows, but we don't talk enough about the fact that look at how much smaller Rome was from the original Roman wall. In other words, they had urban ag going on because the city shrank so much because of the Black Death. People had left the city and people had died. And so the city created spaces. It was where we first started to think about cemeteries as burying people in places where other people wouldn't get sick, right? It also, interestingly enough, created a lot of open space, and people started to think about parks. This idea that instead of rebuilding the entire city in this kind of packed way that they had been doing in the Middle Ages in Europe, let's let some of that open space remain and keep it as park space. And so cemeteries and parks, again, were triggered by this event. It also transformed universities, the rise of the first medical schools. And look at the dates of these first medical schools, right in the middle of the Black Death, the sort of the height of it in the 1300s. And this was a transformation in universities where prior to this, universities were teaching Aristotle. They were sort of theology schools. And the explanation for the Black Death was that this was, we were sinners and God's punishment, right? And that was no longer acceptable to people anymore. They said, we actually want to know why people are dying. And so there was the rise of the research university, the rise of the idea that a university is here to actually figure out why things happen and what do we do about it. A profound shift in higher education, which of course we now all still live with in our research universities, again, triggered by a pandemic. So if we go a little closer to the present day, we don't talk, I think, enough about the mid-19th century cholera pandemic, which swept around the world at various points. It's probably the one that hit the US hardest was in 1854. Cholera, unlike the Black Death, which was a bubonic plague, this was a bacterial infection that came from polluted water. And what had happened is that we were growing cities to be increasingly dense without thinking about the water infrastructure. So people were still having to go out back to a latrine. People were still pouring polluted water right into the streets without thinking about the fact that this is how we transmit disease. And basically, it was a shift in how we think about cities. We thought about cities as sort of large villages. After the cholera pandemic, we began to think that a city is different in kind from a village. So we talk in architecture about high-rise buildings. This is Louis Sullivan's Carson Peary Scott floor plan. We talk about the rise of the elevator, the steel frame. What we don't talk enough about is that these buildings would not have happened without indoor plumbing. Right? You could not build a skyscraper and still have to go to the latrine out back, right? And so I highlighted the plumbing that was in Louis Sullivan's buildings, right? They were very aware that this building could only function if it had those facilities available to people. And so this was a tremendous change in the way we thought about the role of buildings, and it basically enabled us to have the denser high-rise industrial cities of the late 19th century and on into our own time was because of the way in which we began to rethink the role of water in buildings. But they also had enormous urban design impacts. These are two images from Central Park. And we look at fountains and we think they're decorative. They weren't decorative. They were a signal to people in the late 19th and early 20th century that this city had clean water. And if you could have a fountain with water, it was an indication that you cared about water. So you saw the rise of water utilities, sanitary sewers, all of the infrastructure, the water infrastructure that we not take for granted was triggered and necessitated in many ways by the pandemic. It also led to the kind of university that you're in and that I'm in, the land-grant universities. So the land-grant university idea was an idea that was in Congress prior to the cholera pandemic and had languished. It hadn't moved forward. Congress was sitting on it. It was the idea that every state would have a public university. Come the cholera pandemic, it got new life, and Senator Morrill brought it back up, and Lincoln signed it, and it was this idea that we needed universities that had this new field called civil engineering. Prior to this, if you were an engineer, you were basically working for the military. And most engineering was military engineering. And so the idea that there was a civil engineer, somebody who cared about cities and society as opposed to the military, was a new thing that came out of our universities' emergence as land-grant universities. And again, you can look at some of the first ones here, right in the dates, right around the time, right after Lincoln signed the Morrill Act. And so again, you know, one of the things about pandemics for higher education, every time they happen, it forces higher education to become more affordable, accessible, and equitable. And as we think now about the future that we're in, I think we're also going to face that same challenge. And then finally, just to wrap up the history part of this talk, before I get into the future, the present of the future, is the 1918 influenza pandemic, which did not come from Spain, despite its name. It simply came on boats. Many of them coming with soldiers back from World War I. And this was a viral pandemic similar to COVID-19 that particularly affected college-age students. It was incredibly deadly for young people, less so for older people. And the thought was that there had been a variation of this viral pandemic that had come through across the world in a much less lethal form. And so a lot of older folks already had immunity. They didn't know it, but they had immunity. But the younger people in their 20s and younger did not have that immunity, and was very deadly. Again, to think about the architectural implications. Now, many of us in architecture study Villa Savoy, right? And we think about Le Corbusier and talk about his white walls. Why were those walls white? Because it was associated with hygiene. And they were putting materials into the building that could be easily cleaned, right? But the other thing we don't talk about, there's a sink in the front entrance to Villa Savoy. And why was it there? Because you were supposed to wash your hands when you came in the house, because they were concerned about viral transmission. So the very fact that we were all told to wash our hands during COVID-19, the same thing was going on in the 1920s, right? And so these were impacts that, again, we have sort of forgotten about the world in which this architecture emerged. They were very concerned about disease, and the whiteness of the buildings was in effect a kind of statement about cleanliness, but enormous impacts on cities as well. So one of the phenomenon that was happening in 1918, and so many young people were dying, is they were infected in not only in barracks in World War I, but also in college dormitories. And they were also, you know, it was being transmitted through very tight housing conditions of many people. And so led to this dramatic shift in or at least American society toward wanting to live in single family houses and wanting to have private automobiles, not being in transit, staying away from your neighbor. And what's so interesting is that in 1918, they had the same precautions that we had in COVID, which is stay 6 feet apart. And so what got embedded into many zoning codes was a 6-foot side yard setback from your neighbor. The same setback that we were told to keep away from each other, right? And so you see how the pandemic gets embedded into societies and it goes on and on and on. We often forget the reason for them, but that's what was driving them. This also led to a change in the whole financial system in this country. Prior to the 1918 flu, if you wanted to buy a house, it was 50% down in a 5-year loan, which most people could not afford. After that, and banking regulations changed out of political pressure because of the pandemic. And in the 1920s and 30s, there was the emergence of the current 20% down 30-year loan, which made housing much more widely available to people. And so again, the things that we just take for granted were triggered by these events. And then finally, another interesting phenomenon was the rise of the community college system, which was a reaction to the 1918 flu, a desire to socially distance higher ed. And because a lot of young people were getting sick living in dorms, the idea was, well, you can then learn at home. You didn't have to go to college. You could have a community college close enough that you could stay apart and you could socially distance. And so in 1920, which was the year the 1918 flu ended, you had the American Association of Junior Colleges emerge and the widespread embrace of community colleges, again, that were less expensive, more accessible, more equitable, right? So higher ed, again, was forced to be adaptive. And so what does this mean? What does the post-COVID world mean for us in these three areas? What does it mean for architecture, urbanism, and higher education? And what do we do, for example, with all of this space that we now have? I mean, when I talked about the pandemics being accelerants, the United States already had 5 times the amount of square foot devoted to retail per capita as Europe. I mean, we were already way overbuilt in our retail. And so all COVID did is pushed it to say, okay, this is unsustainable. You have way too much space devoted to this activity. And now with digital, online shopping or whatever, we're ending up with a lot of retail space and with the ability to make it actually have the ability to decide, do I work at home today? Do I go into the office? The amount of excess office space that we have is also going to be, I think, a permanent condition for us and really require a lot of the work for architects going forward is reimagining space, repurposing space that we already have. And I would argue that we should take care of that before we start building lots of new space because we have so much in excess that needs to be rethought. But what do we do in cities when so much can get delivered to our door, our device? Why go out? And there are reasons for all of this. I mean, there's clearly a reason to come in face-to-face interactions. And I would argue that's really important. But what we now are in a condition in which we're going to have to figure out what's better done remotely and digitally and what's better done in person and face-to-face. And so it's forced us to think about the role of architectural space, the role of cities, and what are the experiences that we can offer by being in a room together as opposed to being remotely. And so it's the challenge for us because this pandemic has raised the bar on the design community. We've got to create experiences in these spaces that you can't get digitally. They've got to be memorable, right? We can't just sort of expect people to come sit in cubicles all day and do the very things they can do at home. And so the challenge to all of us is, how do you make great spaces? How do you make great experience in those spaces? How do you make spaces that people actually really want to be in? And that is the challenge and the opportunity. And then finally, for universities, for higher education, what does it mean anymore to be a faculty member when you could Zoom in a faculty member from anywhere? And what does it mean to be a student when you could, as this professor at Stanford, realized you can have up to 300 people on your Zoom lecture. So why not have 300 people in every class? Why do we keep it to only the few who are here on campus? And so these are going to be challenges for higher ed too, which is sort of questioning again, why come here? I think there are many reasons to come in person to universities, but they're not the old reasons. We've got to have new reasons for that. And we also have to think about, again, equity, access, and affordability. How come higher education is so unaffordable, is so expensive, when there's an enormous demand globally for knowledge? And we now have the technology to deliver that globally. Why aren't we doing that? And I know you have a global campus here, and I think that Maryland is ahead of many other institutions in thinking about who are our students. I would argue it should be every person on the planet we should think of as a student. So I just thought I'd just quickly go through 3 projects at different scales. So I'm going to show an architectural project, an urban project, and a higher education project. We sort of talk about how post-COVID design is working. And this is a research report I did with Abby Asojo, who is now the current dean at Morgan State. Some of you may know Abby. And we were asked by Ramsey County, one of the urban counties in the Twin Cities, to sort of reimagine service delivery. And their idea is that could we take all of the service delivery in the current county building and distribute it into the library system, into people's neighborhoods? They wanted to empty out the idea of a central administration building. And they wanted us to sort of start to think about what are the decisions they needed to make to create healthier buildings. So, we looked at a whole range of things from, non-touch doors, new kinds of hands-free door latches to restrooms that zap every compartment with UV light between users, a whole set of technologies that are around, again, removing potential disease that might be on surfaces, sort of choosing materials that are either antimicrobial or that are less likely to have viruses or other bacteria on their surface, and also designing the cleaning and maintenance process. So this is something that many of us in the design field think is kind of beneath us or somebody else takes care of that. Actually designing that into the operation of the building is, I think, going to be increasingly important. Also, again, looking at, as we learned in COVID, looking at the HVAC systems, looking at water, again, as a kind of key area for disease transfer and for us to keep people safe. And then what we did is we looked at a bunch of libraries. We began to look at how people actually move through them. So on the left were some of the diagrams we had done of some of the libraries where there was a lot of cross paths. There was a lot of contact from people who were moving around the library in ways that actually encouraged the spread of disease, and developed a whole set of circulation patterns in the libraries that kept people apart and allowed them to socially distance. And what was interesting about this work is that it actually improved wayfinding at the same time and improved the control of the librarians over what was going on. And so it had these other kinds of benefits as well. But again, thinking about when we lay buildings out to sort of think about where are people going to go, and how can we design them in ways so that we minimize the potential of people making each other ill. And then a lot of what we also looked at are what is all the digital technology that's available through voice operation, through motion, what have you, so that we can connect people to services without them having to use their hands, and also without having to go into the big central administration building, so you can access government services in your neighborhood. And then finally, this has really led to this county, radically decentralizing itself. And so this is another phenomenon of pandemics, which is that they sort of focus, urge us to sort of look locally at and focus on what we can do with the existing assets that we have, and to rethink something as simple as meeting with a county administrator, getting information. We also do a lot of work with communities throughout this process. We heard that there were people who were experiencing homelessness. Their biggest need was storage because the police kept raiding their camps and taking all of their stuff. So the idea of the library as a storage place for people who have no other place to store their things. And so this idea of reimagining libraries was happening kind of at the same time as we were doing this. So anyway, there's an architectural example of what we did during the pandemic. I want to talk about an urban one. And the center that I lead does a lot of what we call asset-based community development. And it's a kind of challenge to all of our disciplines. I mean, the design community, for better or worse, and planning community has had a reputation from the 20th century that when we work in communities, we come with a kind of expert model, that we're the trained people, we're going to tell people what to do, we'll show them what they should do, right? I think that is completely wrong. I think that is how you create a lot of damage to cities. And so we do just the opposite. We do a process that we call appreciative inquiry, where we go with great humility and listen and look and observe and ask questions and appreciate what communities have, all the assets that they have, not what they've lost, not what their needs are, what they have that they can build on, right? And so we did this during COVID. We actually worked with a group of communities. We had to do it all remotely because it was right in the middle of the pandemic, is to help them sort of imagine, what would you want your community to look like after the pandemic ends, right? And one of the advantages of my center is, in addition to doing funded research, we also have an endowment. So it allows us to just do things because we think they need to be done. Nobody commissioned us to do this. We just decided somebody needed to start working with communities to imagine a post-pandemic future. So this is a figure ground of the Twin Cities. On the right, far right there is downtown St. Paul. And over here, there's Minneapolis, there's the University of Minnesota. We took a street that goes right through the two cities, right through both incredibly wealthy and incredibly poor neighborhoods, underserved neighborhoods of various kinds. And we really worked with an incredible diversity of people along that road. We mapped a lot of the legacies of inequities in the past, such as the racial covenants from the early 20th century. And we also sort of mapped where there were the greatest digital inequities. In fact, one of the things we did in my center, we spun off several nonprofits out of my center, two of them related to people experiencing homelessness, one that we did with the healthcare community and one we did with the faith community. But we recently spun off a third nonprofit called Smart North, which is about digital equity. And so we're putting tech hubs in underserved neighborhoods, both in the cities as well as in tribal communities in outside of the Twin Cities in greater Minnesota, to help youth particularly get access to technology, which they often don't have. And so again, I think the role of universities is to incubate ideas and organizations and then let them fly, let them go. And several of these nonprofits were started by former students. So I had PhD students, so these were their dissertations, and then they went off and they started these nonprofits. So for all of you who are thinking, what are you going to do after graduation? Start a nonprofit, change the world, do something big, make an impact, right? You don't need to let somebody else tell you what you can do. You can do it yourself. We've probably never had more opportunities for that kind of entrepreneurial effort than we have now. So what we did is we focused on 5 neighborhoods across this street. There was a bus rapid transit line that was being put in place. We also looked at changes that were coming. We did a whole other study just before the pandemic of autonomous vehicles for the National Science Foundation and realized that they are going to have a tremendous impact on our cities as the car industry moves from driven cars to a mobility service model in which they will make the cars, own the cars, and offer us mobility. Now, that may sound like a small thing, but think about that. 30% of our land area and the average is devoted to parking cars. So we are basically going to take the 30% of land that we now give to cars for something else. Open space, affordable housing, you name it, because we're not going to be owning cars in 10 years, and they're going to be offering us mobility at a dramatically lower price than what we're paying now for it. In fact, Waymo, the Google company, their whole model is an advertising-based transportation model in which if we're willing to sit in a vehicle and watch a little advertising on the screen, the ride is free. And so the reason why this will happen is we'll have a choice between, do I buy a $30,000 car or do I get the same mobility for free? And Ford is already moving in this direction. And so this is where we're going, and the impact on cities is tremendous. And so part of this is to sort of realize that during the pandemic, we got accelerated into the digital future. In other words, AI is here now. AI was sort of thought about in research labs. Now AI is here. Autonomous vehicles sort of thought about as sort of marginal things. They are coming quickly. And so this accelerant is really an important thing that we all have to come to grips with, and it has big implications. And so I'll just go through some of what our work with communities came up with. We looked at sort of reimagining our skyway system to have multiple uses, to be places for people. We looked at new ways to sort of think about half-empty office buildings, to not only have housing, but also to grow food, to create incubator space. We heard a lot from community members about the fact that they wanted to be able to have more shared space, less private space. This is in the homelessness issue. We have way too much of a sort of middle-class white idea of what housing is. When we actually work with people experiencing homelessness, they actually want less private space than maybe most middle-class people want. They want more shared space. They need community. And we've heard this over and over again, that the sort of balance of public and private space needs to change if we're going to have more affordable housing, less loneliness, and more community. Also, this idea of changing regulations. Over half of the economy of the United States and half of small businesses come out of people's houses now. And that's, we haven't had a number like that since the early 19th century. And so we have zoning laws that say this is a residential neighborhood, this is a commercial neighborhood. Those zoning policies are meaningless when half of the commerce is coming out of the residential area, right? So we need new terms for how people are actually living and working and making things rather than thinking that our old terms matter. And so we looked at ways in which people are using space creatively for startup businesses. We began to think about all the empty parking garages, parking ramps for tiny home communities, for incubator space. And these were all suggestions that came out of the community. And so what we were doing is simply showing what it could look like and how it might function. But these were ideas that people were telling us, what about all these empty surface parking lots? How can we create family-friendly communities on some of these? You know, how do we reactivate alleyways and other neighborhoods for startup businesses? So we looked at childcare, which was an overwhelming need that we heard from people. When we asked them, what will it take to get you to come back to the office? The number one term we heard was childcare. So we're going to have to be thinking about how we design cities that enable families to thrive. And we saw places like underutilized garages and alleyways as one way to do that. We also, again, looked at, you know, what does a sort of realization that, you know, half of the businesses in America are in people's houses. How do you have income producing activities? If you have autonomous vehicles, what are you going to do with all those 2- and 3-car garages attached to your house that are no longer going to be there for parked cars? How can that be a place for an accessory dwelling unit, a new office, or a rec space, a new business, what have you? We also heard a lot of people in communities wanting to do more collective gardening, more power generation. There was this explosion in community gardens during the pandemic, and people actually got to know their neighbors and realized that they sort of liked their neighbors. And so we heard over and over again, could we continue to do this community gardening in a more concentrated way and actually produce food, produce energy, and what have you? And a lot of this was also this notion of multimodal transportation. Could there be these kind of, you know, empty surface parking lots that could be places where you can pick up an e-bike, you can pick up an hour car, you can pick up a lot of the things that you might need to do to go about your life. A lot of ideas around empty commercial spaces, pop-ups, where, you know, why do we make people rent, you know, a store for a year? You know, why don't you can rent a store for an hour, for a day? You know, one of the tragedies of COVID-19 is it was really difficult for small businesses. And we saw this sort of chainification of American cities where only the big chains survived. And so one of the demands for cities is how do we encourage startup businesses again, local businesses? How do we make it easy for people to start things again? We looked at new kinds of building types that were sort of hybrid between stores and delivery and pickup locations. And again, ways in which we would localize opportunities to lower the cost of entry into business. And then finally, looking at different transportation modes and thinking about what we do in the future. You know, after my book came out, I got a call from Singapore. Singapore is already planning for the next pandemic. And what's been interesting is what they're doing. For example, they now have a regulation in hotels that every hotel has to be transferable or transformable into a healthcare setting. So they're basically thinking of the hotel, the hospitality industry, as the hospital system. And so designing the rooms so that they can be converted to a hospital room, stocking equipment in hotels so that it can be utilized, thinking about the city in terms of how the districts could be self-contained if there was viral spread or disease spread. And, you know, one of the things they're paying attention to is they know, and I write about this in the book, that we got off easy with COVID-19. It was actually not that lethal. Did I do something here? I must have, sorry. But they're worried about things like Ebola, which is can have up to 90% mortality rates. And so again, these are things that we would be wise to think about. And then finally, sorry if I'm going on too long here, there's a lot to talk about, but I did want to talk about higher education, because something I think everybody in the room probably cares about. Because if history is any indication, higher ed is going to go through and is going through a tremendous change. This is an article I did recently in the Chronicle of Higher Education talking about the phygital campus, the idea that we all now live in a world that we're both in space and in a digital space simultaneously. And how do we design educational environments knowing that everybody is simultaneously in at least two different places at the same time? And what does that mean? What do we do on campus? Why have a campus? Why come to a campus? What should we stop doing on campuses? What should we do better someplace else? That was part of this report that came out just recently on higher ed in 2035. But part of the argument here is that, higher ed is still operating by what I call an industrial model, which is that you take a standardized curriculum and you pop out the end with a degree, right? Like going down the assembly line and a car coming out the other end. And we don't live in an economy that's like that anymore. We live in an on-demand mass customization economy. We can decide what songs we have on our playlist. We can decide what we look at in Netflix. We actually are in an economy that has changed, and higher ed hasn't sort of, I think, acknowledged that. And so a lot of the work I've been doing, I'm part of a national group that's kind of reimagining higher ed. There's been this book that came out from Johns Hopkins Press like a month ago called Hacking College. It sold out its first edition in a couple days. A colleague of mine, Scott Carlson at the Chronicle of Higher Education, wrote it, and really writing about, they actually asked students, how are you hacking college, or how would you hack college? And learned all kinds of things from students about what kind of education they want, when they want it, where they want it, and it wasn't at all like what we're providing. And so if higher ed is at all customer sensitive, we should be talking to all of you about what is the new way in which higher education can serve your needs. And out of that come this kind of idea of a new paradigm that, in fact, learning is lifelong. It happens across your whole life. I mean, Stanford is now talking about the fact that if you get into Stanford, you're in Stanford your entire life. You don't just, I mean, you may graduate, but you're there your entire life. You have access to them. You can come back. You can revisit them. You can take courses. You're just a part of their community, right? But this idea at the same time of being able to deliver knowledge where and when it's needed. The idea that universities, this is particularly true for land-grant universities, why aren't we more embedded in communities? And how can we actually utilize what technology showed us we could do during the pandemic? Why aren't we still doing that, right? Why have we gone back as if somehow that never happened? Because those who understand the opportunity will thrive, and those that resist won't. We've been sort of thinking about what are the kind of core knowledge sets that employers want. And when we've done this research, and this is other examples of it, what we hear repeatedly from employers is less technical knowledge and these so-called soft skills. They want people who can communicate, who are creative, who can work in teams, who are independent, because they're knowing that almost everything you learn in terms of a specific technical skill, half of it may be out of date by the time you graduate. And it's certainly going to change radically over your lifetime. And so these are the permanent skills. These are the things that you will always have no matter what comes your way. This is kind of personal resilience. How you have the kind of skills that will enable you to continue to learn and adapt no matter what the changes are that happen. This idea of a purpose, we heard over and over again that students feel a lack of purpose. I mean, they know that students, I want a job, I want a good job, I want a good life, right? But it's this kind of thing that in graduate school, I met Louis Mumford, the historian and writer, and he kept asking me, so what are you going to do with your architecture degree? And I said, well, I guess I'll become an architect. And he goes, no, what do you want to do with your architecture degree? Because what he meant was, what transformation in the world, what difference do you want to make to the world with that degree? He didn't care if I was an architect. He wanted me to do something. And I think that's true for all of us. I mean, why do what we're doing unless we want to make the kind of difference that we see out there? I mean, a lot of this, we're doing a project with the United Nations right now around global climate issues, but we're, very well aware that they've laid out the needs out there. And this, I would argue, there's design opportunities in all 17 of these categories. That even if you're trained as an architect or a planner, you can occupy all of these because our fields touch all of these things, right? So this idea of higher ed is lifelong learning. It's action-oriented, it's problem-oriented. Some of what we're hearing going on in universities around the country is to dispense with our disciplinary-based colleges and schools and to actually re-establish around problems that various disciplines have something to contribute to. And using our design thinking, this is a book by a colleague at Ohio State, David Staley. He's not a designer, but he thinks like a designer. And it's a really creative book to think about, how might we redesign higher education in various ways. In other words, it's not a sort of single way. That's the other problem he lays out for higher education. We're all too much alike. And what we should be doing is, in fact, creating a mass customization higher ed system where if you're visually, spatially intelligent and musically intelligent, maybe there's a way you bring those two things together to learn other ways. In other words, utilize our diverse intelligences and create institutions that build on our assets rather than forcing everybody to come through a kind of standardized curriculum. This idea of what's increasingly talked about in the business community, I think, is also something that higher ed needs to think about, which is what does it mean to be an exponential organization? How do you enable everybody in your organization to have what they call massive transformative purpose? And I would argue that that is the successful workplace of the future. It's not about just sort of doing something. It's like, what transformation does this work have? And what difference are we making to the lives of people? And so this idea of being on demand, paying attention to experimentation, leveraging assets, these are all the things that I think are characteristic of design going forward. And there's a lot of interesting experiments going on. There are a couple institutions in Europe, and one is Nomads, where it's a business school. You don't go to business school, you start a business. And then as you need to learn accounting, as you need to learn HR, they deliver that knowledge to you wherever you are. And what the Nomads do is they realize that's when you really pay attention because you need to know that thing because you're facing that problem now. So what happens if we took architectural education, planning education, and flipped it, inverted it? So you all start somehow and we deliver the knowledge as you need it. I don't know. I mean, that might be a bit of a challenge in some aspects of our discipline, but it's starting to happen in the business world in a big way. And what's happened when you look at the students who have gone through Nomads, they have done amazing things, right? They have started businesses that, and many nonprofits that have had huge transformation. Another interesting group is this group called Chaos Pilots. And their idea is we overly organize learning. And so what they do is they basically see learning as serendipitous. And so they have students learning in a lot of different places. I was influenced by this. Before the pandemic, I had a class where I taught it nomadically and I gave my students the choice about where they wanted to learn. They never picked a classroom, never. We learned on the light rail line. We learned in coffee shops. We learned in hotel lobbies. We learned we learned everywhere, right? They had to make an argument about why we were there because the class was about space, architectural space and how it influences us. But the idea was I was fascinated by where they chose, the fact that they didn't choose the spaces that we have created for them. They chose places where there were serendipitous interactions. Other people would join in the conversation who happened to be in that lobby or on that train with us, right? The other thing that was interesting to me, though, was they remembered the content better. They would remember, oh, that's what we talked about when we were sitting in that hotel lobby by that fireplace looking out over the Mississippi River. That, in other words, architectural space, physical space is a memory device. It's a mnemonic device, right? And so we create these interiors that are sort of bland, right? And we keep coming to the same space and we want students to remember things. These are spaces of forgetting. These aren't spaces of remembering. You will remember when all of your senses are engaged, sound, smell, touch, as well as sight. And so that's what Chaos Pilots are doing, is they're sort of intentionally putting students in as great a variety of educational environments as possible and seeing great results. And then the D school, this idea that you are all not only learning how to be designers, you have a responsibility to design your life, design your career, and you have agency to do that. You're not on an assembly line. You're not, in a predictable environment. You're in a moment in time where there's never been more need for design activity, design thinking than there is now. And so to think about, how you want to be in the world, what impact you want to have is part of the design process for all of you. And so I'll just end by saying that, we don't know what this post-pandemic future is going to be. We don't know the impact fully it's going to have on architecture, cities, or higher ed. And it will probably take decades for us to figure this out. But it really depends on all of you. And it starts now. It's not something in the future. This is something the world needs now and something that you can all do. So with that, thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Tom. We're going to open it up to questions. We have about 15 minutes. Good for hands.
Hello,
Hi.
thank you for your talk today. Who is championing the changes to things like code and regulations? Are there architects who are lobbying, for vast nationwide changes? Or is this something that is more local and homegrown, that is more community-based and like, this is a need we see right now, so let's try to change this right now, right here. And then it spreads out from
Yeah.
there.
So the question, if those you didn't hear, who's working on code change, right? And, one of the things that I think we're in a moment is a sort of hyper-localism. I've been talking about this with regional councils of mayors around the country. I actually gave a talk not too much different from this to the National Council of Mayors. There's a lot of the action is at that level because they're realizing that their codes are in the way, that their communities are struggling and they don't know what to do. And so I think a lot of these code changes you're talking about are going to happen, particularly in zoning, are going to happen obviously at the local level. And there's a strong interest in the mayoral ranks for this. Building codes may be a little different. I mean, health, safety, and welfare, has maybe a different kind of pace, but I also think that they're eager to find ways to give more flexibility to people. So yeah, I mean, the thing is that we will be in a post-COVID-19 world for really the rest of everyone's life here. I mean, this event happened for 2 years, but the impact of this will go on and on and on, as we've seen. We're still living with the tales of previous pandemics, right? And so figuring out what that is and how we can all be active in that is, I think, important. So.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, Tom.
That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I had a question, particularly you were mentioning about how in higher ed do we activate the students' memories, and especially in our profession, where there's a lot of information thrown at us very quickly,
Right.
especially in design studio. Do you envision particular cases that for us, for our profession, that this can really be embraced right away?
Sure. I mean, a lot of the research on memory has to do with how much of our various senses are engaged with it. I mean, we tend to be a profession that's very biased to the visual, and we don't talk about sound, smell, touch, taste, right? But the more we engage all the senses, the more we remember things. And so for architectural education, I would argue the more we can get out in places where you can engage all of your senses, like making things outside in maybe a real community, as opposed to simply drawing it in a studio, is I think, where we might go. I think it would be easier to learn and remember things simply by learning and hearing it in a different place. I mean, I think there's a need for campuses, what I wrote in that Chronicle of Higher Education piece. There's a need for campuses, but it may be not at all along the lines of how we've organized them now. And so I think there's the opportunity for the design community is, how do we have these new forms of education, offered to students? Yeah.
With respect to the ways that architectural education can be reformed, how would you say that specifically designing for health can be integrated into the educational process? Because your example of kind of manufacturing and specifically designing, transportation or, circulation around the building. How do you think that all of these, design aspects and specific, circumstances that you really have to pay attention to, how can that really be taught in a way that's like effective and in a way that can be really absorbed by students, especially given that I agree with you in that case, that, the environments in which students learn also need to be adjusted.
Yeah, well, you have a school of public health here, I know, and you also have an architecture school, and those students in public health also need to do capstone projects. And we found with our own school of public health, the students are really eager to work with designers because they offer something we don't have, and we offer something they don't have, right? To think more creatively about public health challenges. So I think the future of higher ed is in a kind of nomad-like way or chaos pilot-like way, which is to find ways to connect to your fellow students in these other fields, maybe around projects or problems. And I think you'd be surprised how many really value what we do and our ability to sort of think about possible futures. I sort of think of our field as practical futurism, right? We're one of, architects and planners are one of these few fields that's sort of about thinking about what doesn't yet exist. And then we sort of learn practically how do we get there. And we may think everyone does that. No, most disciplines don't know how to do that, right? So if you can work with students in other fields, the roles that you play is, okay, how would we actually get there? What is this thing we want to do? What are the practical steps? And yet at the same time, we learn a lot from them. Like, how is disease transferred? How can we make buildings safer for people? And they're not too far away. That's the kind of funny thing. We're all on this campus. The odd thing, I don't know if you found this, I find it actually easier to do interdisciplinary work off campus than on campus, which is really weird, right? You have to almost like go do a foreign study trip with students from another field, and then everyone gets along and learns from each other. But you come back to campus, we go off to our own buildings and we never talk again. And so it's crazy how we've organized universities around disciplines. I don't think the world cares about our disciplines, frankly. And I think that's part of the message we're hearing from the public. They care about problems and they want to know what we're doing to help solve problems. And we are doing a lot, but we do it in such a fragmented way, in a disconnected way that it seems like we're not making any progress. And so I think kind of reimagining higher ed. And the thing about, past pandemics, they didn't dispense with the old way. In other words, when we had the land-grant colleges, it didn't eliminate all the liberal arts colleges. When we had community colleges, it didn't eliminate the research universities, right? We keep adding layers on higher education as new needs come. And so this is, I see, what's the next layer on the onion of higher education? It's not going to get rid of schools of architecture, but it may be another kind of layer of knowledge or new kinds of interactions among disciplines around problems, even if we all stay in our, tidy little buildings.
I have a question.
Oh, up here, yeah.
My question is more urban planning housing question.
Mhm.
You mentioned that for affordable housing, people wanted more communal living type of living, that they have smaller
Mhm.
private spaces and they share like kitchens or maybe bathrooms or laundry room.
Yep.
My question is that what if we do adapt to that and then there comes another pandemic? We can't tell people to stay in their bedrooms and not to use a shared bathroom or something. It's something that I think about often.
Sure. So, Mike Ostrom, who's at our university, is a public health expert. He said, with the next pandemic, the people who are going to survive are the ones who know their neighbors. It's not going to go to the hospital. If you have neighbors, if you have other people who care about you and are watching out for you, you will do much better. And so a lot of the things we've heard working in communities is a form of housing that's quite common in other parts of the world called co-housing, which is, unrelated people who are living together. Now, a lot of our zoning codes have eliminated that ability. For no reason, as far as we can tell, other than they want to get rid of single room occupancy hotels. And so what they did is they banished the ability of unrelated people to live together, such as what happens in dormitories, for example, in universities. And yet we have a chronic public health crisis of loneliness in this country. Elderly, for example, are struggling with loneliness. We also have an affordability crisis. Young people are struggling with affording their housing. And co-housing works at both of those generations. It allows older people to live with other people so they're not so lonely, and allows younger people to have affordable housing and to help them kind of get into the housing market, right? But we have a financial community that doesn't understand this and is skeptical of it. And so it takes not only designers and planners to sort of enable it to happen for code reasons. It takes also us having conversations with the banking industry, for example, to say that, no, actually, there's a huge market for this and you're missing it. If the next pandemic is a viral pandemic, but I would rather be isolated with 3 or 4 other people I know and care about than in my room by myself. So you might be your own kind of bubble, but better that than not.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Hello. Oh,
Yeah.
hi. My name is Chelsea. I really liked when you were talking about redesigning spaces and converting spaces. Like you mentioned, how can we use car garages and kind of connect neighborhoods and all of that stuff? How do you think the disparity using that kind of design thinking, how does that separate between high income versus low income communities?
Yeah.
Because you also mentioned about plagues and the wealthy were affected, but I think it's almost reversed in this time period. So I was just wondering.
Yeah, and it sort of, depends on what the disease vector is, whether it's, cholera, for example, definitely affected underserved communities more where they didn't have all of the water infrastructure, they didn't have indoor plumbing. The viral, what we found with COVID-19 is the people who were getting sick at first were the people flying around in airplanes. And coming into big cities and flying around a lot, which tended to be more affluent people. So COVID-19 hit the affluent community much faster than it hit less affluent communities. But yeah, obviously a lot of people don't have 2-car garages, right? And so you're right. I think that, this idea of facing up to the inequities we have, pandemics force us to confront the inequities. And I think we all need to be actively taking that on. Now, what's going on in our federal government is a bizarre kind of reaction to what I think is going to be inevitable, which is that, these are needs that people have, and you can't leave so many people behind. You have to actually work on these inequities. This Smart North nonprofit that we launched out of my center, what's been interesting is we put these tech hubs in health clinics because so many underserved youth not only don't have access to technology, they might be hungry, they might be ill-housed, they might not even have access to winter clothing, which in Minnesota matters. And so what we've done, and they won't go necessarily into health clinic, but they'll go in if there's technology in there. And so we wrap around services. So while they're learning technology and have access to technology, we also, the social workers in the clinic get to know them and sort of figure out, are there other issues you're dealing with in your life, right? And so bringing all of these things together are really helping people kind of deal with it, whatever their challenges might be. And that was a design idea when we came up with this. It wasn't like, let's just build a bunch of tech hubs. No, where we put them and how we did it mattered. again, I think a lot of design is what, somebody asked me, my center was in theory started 40 years ago as an urban design center, and we still do a lot of urban design, but most of what we do now is our system design projects. And that's where the real need is something is not working in the world, and they need designers to help them think about creative new ways to do that thing. And it's really about big systems rather than just particular sites. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sophia. I'm a senior, and I wanted to ask you for some advice. There's a lot of us are going into the working force. How do we bring up ethics as new employees? I'm very interested in sustainability, for example, but like, what is the best practice, the best way to kind of stay with with your values, to not like, maybe I want to make sure the materials we use are locally sourced. How do I speak up without, I don't know, getting blacklisted?
Yeah, well, I've often felt that our field has a lot of unleveraged power. I mean, think about what architects do. We buy a lot of stuff. We specify a lot of stuff. And I don't think we ask enough questions of manufacturers about materials. What is its carbon footprint? What is its, how is it made? How are you treating, how is this, how are the people who made this treated? I've long argued that this is a role the AIA could play, that we need to recognize that power of us to say, if you can't answer these questions that we care about, that our clients care about, communities care about, we're not specifying your products. And so we do have leverage. And I think that this is where younger people, particularly, you also have leverage in your offices. We actually do have a workforce shortage, which is, I think, good news for everyone here, I hope. But, you have leverage in your offices. And so speak up if something's meaningful to you. From all the successful firms I know, they're listening to their younger people. Because it's the only way they're going to keep young people is to listen. So, yeah.
Hello. My question has to do with design research.
Yeah.
And what is your approach or methodology in terms of holding certain real life conditions like zoning as true, but then suspending them in certain design research projects versus applying them in others? And how do you go about that, like for pragmatic solutions instead of keeping all of those real world conditions like true? Like,
so you're talking about, how do we sort of form research questions around holding certain things common so that we can experiment with others?
yes.
Yeah. It's interesting. We don't work that way. I don't see the communities we work in as our subjects. We're not researching on them. In fact, we're learning from them. They're our teachers. And so we do a lot of listening and we co-create with them solutions. So it isn't research in that sense, although we learn a tremendous amount. And, so I think, again, in some ways, I think the paradigm of research is also changing, which is, I gave a talk to all the university librarians at a conference a few years ago. And I made the argument that we do so much damage to the world because we don't organize knowledge in the way the world is organized. The world is organized spatially and geographically. In other words, there's hydrology, there's geography, there's community in every square inch of the world, right? We've organized knowledge horizontally so that the one discipline doesn't talk to another. In our Library of Congress system separates knowledge. The world is not separated. It's a single thing, right? And I think that so I actually proposed to all the librarians, get rid of the Library of Congress system and use GIS as the way to find knowledge, which is find it spatially and recognize. And this is an indigenous way of knowing too. This is how indigenous communities knew the world, right? And the reason they didn't do so much damage to the world is they organized their knowledge of the world the way the world worked, the way nature worked. And so I think that, part of what has to happen in universities is to challenge the scientific paradigm that you just mentioned. I don't want to hold certain things in common, in constant, so I can do an experiment, right? I actually want to, sort of, learn it all, hear it all, and understand that what is true here may not be true over there, right? And that's another challenge, is we have this idea that knowledge is this universal thing, and I don't believe it. I don't think it is universal. I think it is very contextual, very local, very culturally driven, and that our role, and that I think is our advantage. We are disciplines that are about particular places. Despite the international style, we don't do universal things. We do for this client and this site for this need now, right? And I would argue that that is the way in which we will know in the future. It's here and now. And it's not this kind of assumption that we can come up with universal rules that will apply everywhere. Look at the damage we did to our environment when modern architects thought that that was true. You could build the same building anywhere in any client in any culture. Look at the damage that did. So I think we have to learn that lesson. So I'm sorry, maybe not the answer you were looking for, but all right. I've kept you long enough, I think. Thanks everybody for listening. Thanks for your questions.
Thank you. I do want to say that we're going to roll right out of here into the great space and further this conversation there with Tom. So please join us. Thank you.